In my review of Monster Hunter Wilds, I had a chapter discussing how the game pushed current gen systems with a variety of different features, many centered around ecological simulations, going far beyond what Monster Hunter World achieved. To my surprise, I received a lot of comments that, while agreeing that those features were cool, questioned their necessity when the game runs so badly, even on current gen hardware. This is something I found quite surprising because Monster Hunter World was frequently praised for having what felt like a living, breathing world. Meanwhile, the very next game, Monster Hunter Rise, was heavily criticized for cutting many of those features. Wilds brought them all back and goes even further than World, yet now that game is getting flack for it, with many people saying those environmental features are not necessary to the experience at all. Which brings us to today's topic. Is ecology necessary for Monster Hunter? We're going to discuss this series' history with the subject, and how it's been implemented in different games, but also the impact of those features on both a gameplay and technical performance front, and whether it's worth having them or not. Yuya Tokuda is the director of Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Wilds. He's been working on the game since almost the very beginning, with his first credits being on Monster Hunter G back in 2005. Tokuda joined Capcom after seeing trailers for the very first Monster Hunter game. He was impressed by how the monsters in the game didn't only feel like bosses, but real living creatures. He liked how the game was trying to depict something of an ecosystem, where the bosses were simply part of the natural world. Since joining Capcom, he's had a hand in pretty much every major Monster Hunter game since then. Tokuda's interest in this specific aspect of Monster Hunter remained throughout the years, and he was able to start incorporating more of his desires relating to it as he was promoted. With the third game, he was given the task of redesigning Rathalos, and did so in a way that made him look much more natural, with wings better suited to flying and claws better shaped for killing and carrying prey. It was also around this time that he began requesting series executive producer Ryozo Sugimoto to direct his own Monster Hunter game, but he was rather inexperienced at the time, so his request wasn't approved. That is, until after Monster Hunter 4 and 4 Ultimate's release, a game Tokuda worked on as lead planner. Did exceptionally well in the West. In 2014, Sugimoto finally offered him the role of director for the very next main game in the series. He was tasked with creating a next-generation Monster Hunter game for home consoles that appealed to both the East and the West. Finally, Tokuda was at a point in his career where he could fully enact his creative vision for the series. That is, to create a living, breathing world for Monster Hunter. When Sugimoto requested a next-generation Monster Hunter for home consoles, he was talking about the PlayStation 4 and equivalent systems. In the past, Monster Hunter games had been developed for the PlayStation 2 and for later entries, hardware not much stronger than that. As such, they were incapable of presenting a truly robust ecosystem in gameplay. Instead, the idea of there being real ecosystems was represented in other ways, namely pre-rendered computer-generated cinematics. Monster Hunter used to have plenty of these that would play upon booting up the games, in addition to being unlocked through gameplay. Are any of you familiar with those cinematic Star Wars The Old Republic trailers, with those insanely cool animations, fight choreography, music? The actual game isn't anything like that, but the trailers give an idea of what the gameplay is trying to do, what it's representing, the vibes it's trying to go for. Likewise, Monster Hunter cinematics are interesting because they're often less about the actual monster hunting. After all, the games were already pretty good at that, but instead showing the world as a natural place. The cinematic for the very first game does this quite well, featuring Velociprey hunting down an Aptonoth, only for Rathalos to steal the kill for himself. This is true for other in-game unlockable cinematics too, where we can see Kezu eating a Kelbee, Plesioth ambushing an Aptonoth from a river, and Rathian feeding her young. There's more of this in DOS and Tri, and it shows that the games always did have an interest in presenting this stuff to people, they often just didn't have the ideal means. Despite the hardware they were working with not really jumping much in power, the developers were still able to introduce more ecological elements into actual gameplay for later entries. Namely in Tri for the Nintendo Wii, monsters can become exhausted in this game for the first time. This happens after a while during hunts and allows for a breather period where the monster becomes slower and more feeble for a while, visibly drooling. Better yet, it often prompts them to hunt for food, which can lead to them hunting and killing a small monster elsewhere on the locale. Speaking of, this game introduced a cool feature where the smaller monsters would get visibly agitated if a large monster was in an adjacent area, which actually really helped with locating and tracking. Sometimes the games would require you to carry an egg from a monster nest all the way back to camp, but certain monsters such as Rathian or Rathalos would zero in on you when holding them, which made these quests quite difficult. On the other hand, it made eggs a useful tool for luring those monsters towards you. There's a nice mixture of gameplay and visual features that enhance the atmosphere, making the world feel alive and varied, while also enhancing the gameplay by providing mechanics that you can exploit. In 2018, Yuya Tokuda's directorial debut game Monster Hunter World finally released, and the generational leap could be felt even at first glance. The game that had these huge seamless environments with so much life, ecosystems with all kinds of either tiny, small, or large monsters that felt like they really lived there. The locales had dynamic day and night cycles with so much to discover. They felt more alive than ever before, and it was a huge jump for Monster Hunter. Arguably, Tokuda had finally implemented what was always abstract in the series into gameplay. In fact, World was the first game to launch with no pre-rendered CGI monster cinematics, because there was no longer a need. All of what used to be shown there was now possible to represent in gameplay. Up to 3 individual large monsters could roam around on the giant seamless sandbox-like locales, and they had unique habits, behaviours, nesting areas and more. They would actively hunt smaller monsters, mark their territory, turf war with other large monsters, and even sometimes just chill out somewhere. There was a tool that made you invisible to them, allowing you to follow them around and really get a sense of their day-to-day life. None of this was at all mandatory for beating them either. It was all extra and helped enhance the atmosphere of the game. Monsters now had varying aggression levels, some were totally neutral, others would warn you to leave before engaging in battle, while for a select few it would be on sight. Many elder dragons wouldn't even attack you unless provoked, instead passively observing you, as they didn't see you as a threat, which gave them a really unique characterization. And there was so much life elsewhere. Small creatures that had their own routines and behaviours, such as the revoltures who hung around monsters that are near death and then come down to feast on their corpses. Even the NPCs had lots of detail, a particular favourite being the feline chefs in Seliana. You can watch them perform every major step in the bread making process, and it's really entertaining and adorable. World was a massive hit, quickly becoming not only the highest selling Monster Hunter game, but the best selling Capcom game of all time. The game was widely praised for its combat, but also the setting, the way the monsters felt like real creatures living in a real environment. World was many people's first Monster Hunter, and it was a fantastic first impression. Many older fans also played World and loved it for similar reasons. It really did feel like the game the developers had always wanted to make for so very long. Things like turf wars, formerly witnessed only in cutscenes, were now happening in real-time gameplay. Monsters we'd grown up with were now rendered with modern high-definition visuals, and combined with all their new behaviours, it simply felt like the future of Monster Hunter, a true generational leap. Yuya Tokuda, series director Konami Fujioka, and executive producer Ryozo Sugimoto have spoken extensively about how they were able to pull this off. It wasn't an easy process at all, and it especially would not have been possible without the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, systems that were roughly 2 whole generations stronger than the PS2, Wii and 3DS. They were able to use the full power of these systems to really create these ecological simulations. World, like any game, had its shortcomings, but there's a reason it remains special in people's hearts, and it marked a major turning point for the series. As Monster Hunter World became a huge success, Rise was actively in development. The game was targeting the Nintendo Switch, a handheld with power roughly equivalent to the PlayStation 3. Initially, the developers of Rise were planning to have the game scoped similarly to the pre-World games. It was going to have segmented areas and similar graphics, but the success of World caused them to rapidly shift gears. That game was widely praised for being a Monster Hunter with seamless environments and high quality visuals, which prompted the Rise team to step up their game. When Rise finally released, it was indeed one of the most technically impressive games on the Switch. Expansive areas, a consistent frame rate, realistic graphics that were more like World than the older games. Rise had seamless environments that actually allowed you to run up virtually any cliffside, and the new wire bugs allowed for free swinging, giving the game a very different sense of traversal compared to World. However, there was much less of a focus on ecology. There wasn't nearly as much roaming endemic life, with the exception of stationary special critters that served as power-ups. Monster AI was severely stripped down too. They don't really have the same dynamic behaviours and routines as they do in World. They tend to have some special animations, but you don't get to see them often because the aggression system from World is simplified. Monsters in Rise will aggro on you after a very short amount of time in their presence, and there's no Giddy Mantle to prevent that. There's just less details across the board and less cool nature-based mechanics you can exploit. Much of this was due to hardware constraints. While World was developed for hardware 2 generations ahead of the older games, Rise was instead a single generation ahead, and for a handheld with a battery life no less. World's environmental simulations tend to be heavy on a device's central processing unit or CPU, as they have to handle a lot of rapid calculations and keep track of many independent entities. The Switch's CPU was not up to the task, and to this day, World isn't even on the system. So while they were able to implement a fair amount of World's features such as seamless locales, free roaming monsters, turf wars, and even this time free wall climbing and grappling hooks, they couldn't really have that game's level of ecology. Once again, it was mostly saved for the cinematic monster introduction cutscenes, and people were not fans of this. World had introduced a lot of people to the series, and Rise's environment simply didn't do it for them. They were blasted as empty, lifeless, boring. Rise was supported for 3 years, and in that time, many lamented at the long wait for a true successor to Monster Hunter World. Wilds was announced in 2023 and slated for 2025, the long-awaited sequel to World, developed for the next generation of hardware targeting the PS5, Xbox Series and modern PCs. Even though World was highly ambitious for the PS4, it was still held back by that system's hardware, in particular its awful CPU relative to what hardware was capable of at the time and low storage speeds. The PS5 did not suffer from those same limitations at all. Not only that, but Yuya Tokuda was directing this game once more. What kind of crazy ecosystems could we see this time? How much further could they go? Well, for one, Wilds allows for 8 monsters on any given locale. You can choose to hunt any of them, same with any other hunter with you. Not only that, but each locale has 3 very different seasons that change over in real time, cycling the monsters in and out. The locales have connected base camps and villages, with NPCs and their daily routines. There's dozens of small monster packs that have their own behaviours, including hunting other small monsters, attacking larger ones, stampeding, not to mention a lot of new endemic life, similar to what Monster Hunter World has, such as these tiny crabs that approach and feast on monster corpses, which themselves remain in the locale for a long time and rot into carcasses, surrounded by buzzing flies. This is true of small monsters too, only they become bone piles that you can gather from. There's a lot to this, I'm not even scratching the surface. There's so many moving entities that all kind of work together in ways you wouldn't expect. For example, in the Windward Plains, there's hordes of roaming herbivores called Ceratonoth. The male of the species has these giant spikes. Why? Because one of the seasons in this locale has giant lightning storms, and the spikes serve as lightning rods that protect the females. You can see them absorbing the strikes in real time. You can sometimes find birds called Northpeckers that sit on the Ceratonoth and pick parasites off them in a symbiotic relationship. The plains are also home to these little guys called wind rustlers. They run around during the plenty season and stay away from danger, but will actively find somewhere to hide during the dangerous sand tide. If you decide to follow them, you can find their various hiding spots. Some include man-made lightning rods that absorb the strikes so the little guys won't get hit, but others will actively seek out male Ceratonoth to hide with, knowing they'll be safe from the lightning. This is just one specific example, in one of 5 locales, but the entire game has stuff like this going on all the time, changing by the season. Wilds goes beyond World, even in the little things. For example, activating a Vigor Wasp in the former game causes it to fade away before respawning with its nectar restored sometime later. In Wilds, it continues to exist and hang around, and will refill its nectar manually by going to a vitality plant. The game lets you or monsters set grass and oil on fire. It's things like that. The connected village and base camps also allow for a greater degree of NPC interactions, where you can sometimes find villagers travelling and working out and about. In every other game, the palico that carts you back to camp will rush off into the distance. In Wilds, they're an actual NPC in the base that, after carting you, will run across the map all the way back to base. I could keep going, but I'd be here for a while. So to summarise, I would say that while Monster Hunter World provides the illusion of a living, breathing world, Wilds turns it into a reality. So to call back to the basis of this discussion, why are Monster Hunter fans, scratch that, Wilds players in general, upset at how Wilds has handled these ecosystems, when the whole thing seems like a massive upgrade to what World was doing? It comes down to 3 words: poor technical performance. I don't need to get into it, we know Wilds runs badly. PCs struggle to hit 60 frames or higher, on recommended and superior specs, and while consoles like the PS5 run the game better than the PS4 ran World, the state of things is far from ideal compared to contemporary AAA video games. Some of this is due to broken functions. For example, texture decompression hasn't been working properly on PC for some time, which causes stutters every time you turn the camera. But much of it is due to the ecological simulations Wilds is doing, as described in the previous chapter. It's doing far more than World, and once again, all this stuff is calculated and kept track of by the CPU and rendered by the GPU in real time, and it can be quite heavy. For example, when I'm fighting Rey Dau in his nest, the wind rustlers are actively looking for places to hide. When I've killed my first target in a multi-monster quest and I'm fighting a second one, the corpse is actively decaying and that crab is feasting on it. This kind of stuff was true for Monster Hunter World as well, but that game was doing a lot less, while Rise was doing practically none of it, and both of those games run much better than Wilds on the same hardware. On top of that, although Wilds is a good looking game, it's not good looking enough to justify such heavy performance because the root cause is all the ecological simulations going on. So as a result, players are questioning the necessity of the ecology and ecosystems because they're tanking performance. If the game would run so much better without it, why is it here? And this calls into question whether or not ecology is necessary for Monster Hunter at all, which is a very fascinating discussion considering it's the vision of Director Yuya Tokuda, as well as prior series director Konami Fujioka. They want these games to be a window into a living natural world, and have been working towards it since the very beginning. What we're witnessing is a disconnect between the creators and the audience, and I want to get into it further. Monster Hunter games are action-based, focused around fighting monsters with large weapons in somewhat lengthy battles of attrition. Action games naturally need to have a stable, if not a high frame rate, and historically most Monster Hunter games have been good with this. With Wilds having a clear culprit for the constant performance drops, it's given people something to turn their ire towards, but it goes further. A lot of people are calling the ecological simulations pointless, because much of it doesn't really contribute to the actual monster hunting. Recall tries features such as monster exhaustion, or expanded small monster behaviour, the former affecting the tempo of the hunts, and the latter making tracking easier. Many of the features in Wilds do not have anything close to the same impact. For example, all monsters appear to have their full behaviour and AI active at all times, no matter where you are on the locale. This was not the case for Monster Hunter World or Rise, easiest to see in the latter game, where the more open locales allow you to see the monsters from really far away. They won't really be doing anything but moving around, but as you get closer they'll sort of snap to it and act the way they should, whether that is entering a turf war or attacking smaller monsters. The reason for this was to save scarce CPU resources on the Nintendo Switch, because the developers decided that having the monsters be constantly active was too much of a drain. Meanwhile, the PS5 and equivalent systems have vastly better CPUs, so the developers felt they could expend them on actually keeping the monsters fully active in Wilds all the time. The result of this is that they can do things like get paralysed by Vespids on the other side of the map, or turf war with each other even when you're not present, which is strange and doesn't really impact the gameplay at all. Turf wars are really cool, but what's the point of them if you're not present to actually see the fights? Here you can see dozens of Ceratonoths, which is significant because World, Rise, or any of the older games did not come close to having this many small monsters active at once, let alone across the whole locale. Having this many adds to the atmosphere for sure, but it doesn't change how I'm going to be playing the game, and the CPU is keeping track of every single one of them and their unique season-dependent behaviours, as well as their interactions with other entities at all times, including all the endemic life that function alongside them. You could cut these numbers by 2/3, and gameplay-wise it wouldn't change much at all, while massively easing hardware strain. Most of this stuff only really contributes to the atmosphere of the game, but arguably that is important too, especially when you consider prior series discourse. I talked about how Rise cuts back much of what World was doing and got flamed for it during its heyday. Team Darkside made a video where they basically compared a lot of these details between the games. The thumbnail, for example, shows Tigrex behind a Paratoad. In Iceborne, the Paratoad becomes visibly frightened by the giant hulking beast behind him, but in Rise it doesn't react at all. The whole video is filled with examples like this, of a specific detail in World that Rise either omits or heavily simplifies. Again, this is all based on hardware power. World, being designed for the at the time robust PS4, is keeping track of the Paratoad's behaviour in the moment, whether or not a monster is nearby, and updating him accordingly. However, with Rise, the Nintendo Switch has scarce CPU resources, so they're not spared on him. But regardless, this video did make the rounds and was used in a lot of discussions. In particular, World fans used it to show how lifeless and worse Rise was compared to the former game. And yes, Rise's ecosystems, if you'd even call them that, were simplified, so the Nintendo Switch could run the game to an acceptable degree. We know why the game is so different in that regard, but that doesn't change the fact that World's worlds feel so much more alive by comparison, and to many people, it was a showcase of how much better the game was. My stance on it all, both at the time and now, is that these ecology simulations are nice to haves. It's cool when they're there, but I don't see them as being critical to the experience. And in most cases, their absence didn't really affect my enjoyment of Rise. But this is why I'm so fascinated by the reaction to Wilds, because truth be told, the Paratoad behaviour is arguably as pointless as having the hordes of Ceratonoth with all that related endemic life and unique behaviour, or even other cases like the people of Azuz carrying out the Fire Spring ceremony in real time, even when you're hunting. But with World, people didn't have an issue, and praised the game for having such details like that. and then heavily criticised Rise for omitting them. Wilds brings them back and more, only for people to hate and consider them unnecessary. From my perspective, World fans got what they wanted. The next game in the series goes even further in creating a living, breathing world. Bigger maps, more large and small monsters, changing weather that affects their behaviour, tons more detail, an actual living, breathing world. And they're not happy because it tanks their performance and they'd rather have a solid 60 frames per second or higher. An interesting thing to remember is that Monster Hunter World, like Wilds, had massive performance issues at launch that were arguably much worse on all platforms. Wilds can reach 60 frames per second on PS5 at the cost of resolution, but here you can see World running sub 30 frames on the PS4. Not even the Pro consoles could hit 60 frames either, and this was coupled with extremely lengthy loading times. While the PC version received a lot of criticism for being non-functional in lots of aspects, the console version by my memory was received fine. The game sold very well and was a breakout hit for the series, which calls into question why Wilds was received so much worse. And I think the reason for that is not only shifting attitudes towards acceptable frame rates, but also the ecosystems in World being a novelty. The game was doing impressive and new things for Monster Hunter, and it impressed not only long-time fans, but also people playing the series for the first time. Everyone was wowed by all this stuff and missed it in Rise, so that means Wilds doing it all again but slightly better is seen as less impressive. And now that having a solid 60 frames per second is the standard for console games, people are less than thrilled that it's tanking their frames. Mark Cerny is a freelance video game designer, programmer, and producer who has worked in the industry since the 80s. Today he's often hired by Sony to lead the design on their consoles, including the PlayStation Vita, 4, 5, and more recently the PS5 Pro. During a presentation for that system, he revealed that for PS5 games, 75% of all users pick performance mode over quality when given the choice.
When asked to decide on a mode, players are choosing performance about 3/4 of the time.
For those unfamiliar, video games on consoles, especially nowadays, tend to offer different visual profiles. Graphics mode aims for higher quality visuals at the cost of frames, often going for 30 per second. Performance mode, on the other hand, aims for 60 frames per second or higher while sacrificing graphical features or resolution. It's hard for games to do both, so developers give people choice. Some games have more varied profiles that really let people fine-tune what they want, but bare minimum, you'll see two for the majority of modern games. And Cerny revealed that the vast majority of people would rather have 60 frames per second instead of the best visuals. Before the PS5, I would say that 30 frames per second was the standard on consoles. People who really cared about solid performance simply played on PC, but now things are a lot different. Performance modes are an industry standard, and gamers across the board are used to playing with higher frames. Even on the Switch 2, every game Nintendo released in 2025 ran at 60 frames per second. 60 frames per second on games makes them feel better to control, better to watch. I've made the point of this before, but all my footage when possible is 60 frames for this reason. And people will sacrifice graphics for this feature because they don't see having the best visuals to be as critical to the experience as a smooth video. 75% of all PS5 users means a huge amount of even casual players prefer having a smooth video than the highest quality image, because most people can feel the difference. When looking at Wilds with this knowledge, it would seem that people see the ecosystem simulations in the same way. I said that when comparing World and Rise, I didn't see the latter game lacking all those details as a serious flaw that affected my enjoyment. I merely saw them as nice to haves. And just now, I said World's ecosystems were more or less a novelty. So I think the truth is that most people also see the ecological simulations in the exact same way, as nice to haves or novelties, that are not important or critical to the experience at all. So from that standpoint, Wilds having bigger and more robust ecosystems is providing bigger nice to haves, and people would give them up in a heartbeat if it guaranteed solid performance, because fundamentally, so much of this stuff is simply glorified background detail. Granted, this situation is a bit more nuanced because Wilds is doing a lot, as in way more than it reasonably should be doing. Like monsters having their full AI active at all times. Why? What's the benefit to them having turf wars when we're nowhere near them? World and Rise only triggered those when we were in the vicinity, so we could actually see them. So why does Wilds feel the need to be doing all that? And it's not even just the large monsters, but everything. The small monsters, endemic life, NPCs. The environment consists of a ton of moving parts that are all constantly working together, and while it can result in the occasional cool unscripted gameplay moment, it's hard to say whether that justifies it all. Wilds does not lead with its best foot forward in presenting its ecosystem to you either, because the Sacred's autopathing heavily disincentivizes you from exploring on your own. World and Rise had you walk and swing everywhere manually, and get a feel for the lay of the land on your own. but Wilds lets you get away with going on your phone half the time. There's other things too. World had this private room that you could decorate, including with endemic life you'd captured that would hang out as pets, which naturally incentivized people to go out and catch what they could, which led to them actively exploring and discovering. Wilds had nothing of the sort at launch. Later down the line, as a response to criticism, they added this digital compendium thing that displayed all the endemic life you've captured. It's obviously a bit rubbish and nowhere near as good. Wilds doesn't tend to give you reasons to actively seek out the dozens of little environmental interactions going on, while World certainly did, particularly with the Gromolkin side quests. World was also released in the age of the share button, where people could post clips of the cool details they'd seen, which boosted discussion of the game and encouraged people to seek them out on their own. Some moron eliminated that feature, so it's harder to do for Wilds. So World made you engage with its environments to a greater degree, and gave you incentives for doing it in a way Wilds does not. I was being a bit unfair to World fans when describing their attitude toward Wilds environments, because there's a lot Capcom could do to make people engage with them a bit more, that they just haven't done. Before we proceed, I do want to mention something important. Wilds' ecological simulations are limited to the locale you're in. Nothing is happening in the Scarlet Forest while you're in the Windwood Plains. Even though the game does let you walk from one to the other, my understanding is that has very little, if anything, to do with the game's poor technical state, as the locales will be dynamically loaded and unloaded accordingly. Regardless, Capcom have found themselves in a very difficult situation. World pushed the limits of the PS4 and ran badly. Rise pushed the limits of the Switch and ran stable but was obviously limited. Both games are available on more recent hardware and run fantastically there. This is another reason why people are rather annoyed at Wilds, because it runs so much worse on the exact same hardware, and considering the key difference with this game is the much heavier ecological simulations, it's not hard to see what the culprit is. Tokuda, Fujioka and Tsujimoto were open about how the power of the PS4 had let them take Monster Hunter to the next level with World. They were also open about the same situation occurring with the PS5 and Wilds. Prior to launch, Tokuda was once again discussing how Monster Hunter's original implication of a real robust ecosystem had driven him to work at Capcom and on the series directly, which has led him to where he is today, the director of their biggest games ever. To be honest, it was always clear in my mind that was the direction I wanted to take it. Any Monster Hunter game where I'm director is always going to be focusing on the ecosystem element. As the hardware generations we're working on get more and more powerful, I want to use the specs of the hardware to the max in order to depict as convincing a living, breathing world as I can. In other words, Tokuda's MO is to use all the hardware power at his disposal for the sake of the ecosystems. This is his vision. He pushed the PS4 to the max, which is why World ran badly there. He pushed the PS5 to the max too, which has ended in the same result, while also stressing PC hardware, which has stagnated in recent years and no longer has a massively significant power gap between consoles. It's worth mentioning that actual tangible gameplay elements have been made possible through the power of the PS5. For example, Legiacris and similar bodied leviathans were not possible in Monster Hunter World or Rise due to limited hardware power. In fact, Legiacris had to be cut from Monster Hunter World because he kept tanking the game's performance, but Wilds was able to implement him without issue. This is also the case for monsters like New Udra and Shei-Wu, with their 6 tentacles and large bodies. They're only possible on new hardware and have become fan favourites for a reason. The 8 monsters on a locale, in addition to the connected base camps and field surveys, certainly would not have been possible on the PS4 either, and those are all elements I'm a huge fan of. People do generally like a lot of these additions, but the same cannot be said for Wilds' larger and more robust ecosystems. The question this video asks has been, is ecology necessary for Monster Hunter? We know for certain that the ecosystems are why the game is so heavy on modern hardware. Should Capcom keep focusing on them? I would say yes. The features added in Tri and Beyond were really nice, and I think that despite me not minding Rise lacking many of World's features, it did feel quote unquote low rent, for lack of a better term. A lot of the emissions shown in that Team Darkside video did feel a bit much, and while they were necessary for the Switch hardware, I hope they can keep more of them in the eventual successor to Rise. Either way, is ecology necessary is not the question we should be focusing on. Tri's features were not heavy at all, and Monster Hunter wouldn't be the way it was without the world feeling rather alive ever since the very beginning. What drew Tokuda to these games is also what attracted many of us, even before the creation of Monster Hunter World's ecosystems. This stuff is necessary to the uniqueness of the games. So it's not a question of whether or not Capcom should be focusing on ecology. The real question is, should Capcom start becoming more conservative about pushing hardware to the limits? World, Rise and Wilds are not outliers. Every Monster Hunter game from the PS2 to the PSP to the 3DS pushed their respective consoles and became really nice technological showcases. Possible Third was one of the most impressive games on the PSP, as was For Ultimate on the 3DS. They didn't often run the best, but that wasn't as prevalent of an issue back then. World, however, was the first game to get a mainstream PC release, and a console performance buff through backwards compatibility, meaning that though the game ran badly at launch, it improved drastically over time without major input from the developers, as people adopted new hardware. This is also why World's bad technical performance at launch is no longer remembered. It was 8 years ago now, and people have been capable of running the game much better for far longer than it ran badly. And Rise 2 later released on better hardware, which unlocked its potential. Which leads me to a conspiracy theory about Wilds that has never been said or implied by anyone working at Capcom. It's just my own personal speculation. Crysis was a first-person shooter released in 2007 that was infamous for being difficult to run on PC because of its high-quality visuals. In actuality, the developers Crytek had configured the settings so that PCs with their current GPUs at the time would be able to run the game on low to medium settings, but high and ultra were intended for future hardware and GPUs. The intent was to future-proof the game. At the time, games, hardware, visuals were advancing so often that Crytek didn't want Crysis' visuals to age badly, so they intended for GPUs in the next many years to be able to run the game at higher settings than what was currently possible, allowing the game to still look good several years on. It's unfortunately led to the game gaining an interesting legacy as people on current hardware try to access those settings. My guess is that Capcom, on some level, intended the same thing for Monster Hunter Wilds. They saw World's performance being tolerated in 2018 and then boosted after 2020 without developer input, and therefore banked on the same thing happening for Wilds. People with current hardware may not be able to run the game to acceptable standards today, but in a few years, PC hardware will advance further, and the PlayStation 6 will release, allowing for everyone to experience the game the way it should have been. The difference is that unlike Crysis, the advancements were less about visuals and more about having an easier time carrying the weight of the ecosystems. If this is the case, the gambit has utterly backfired, not just because Wilds' poor performance has led to the game receiving mass backlash and tacking in sales, but because the consumer hardware market is ruined. This topic is bigger than Monster Hunter, or even gaming as a whole, but there's a major shortage of RAM right now, thanks to OpenAI purchasing 40% of all manufacturing for the next several years, causing all companies to have to scramble for what remains. Prices have shot through the roof, and RAM manufacturers like Micron have confirmed they're moving away from selling to regular consumers and instead are focusing on AI data centers. I built my PC in late 2024 and purchased 64GB of RAM for £159. That same RAM now costs more than £800. It's obscene, and prices won't just shoot up for us, but anything that uses RAM. PC manufacturers, consoles like the PlayStation 5 or Switch 2, it's been rumoured that future phones will launch with less RAM as a result of this. Just recently, there was a report that GPUs are literally going to double in price. SSDs have increased in price too. Things are looking very bad right now. You should keep this all in mind when you see discussions pertaining to why people dislike generative AI. This technology is ruining a lot of good things we've enjoyed for years, to little or no benefit. The point is that nobody will be upgrading their PCs in the future. Consoles will shoot up in price, and the next generation of systems rumoured to be releasing in 2027 may be delayed by this move. If Capcom were banking on future hardware to run Wilds better, they need to pivot away, because it simply will not work out. I said that the difference between World and Wilds is that the former game technically gave the illusion of an ecosystem, while on the other hand, Wilds actually has one. The monster AI being active constantly, even if you're idling at base, is a huge example. The world is actually alive. However, this is what is fundamentally stressing everyone's hardware. Maybe World's illusion was smarter than Wilds' reality, and I think it's clear that it, and or future games, cannot be doing this anymore. There's no real tangible benefit to it. People are not wowed anymore, and it's driving performance down across the board. There wasn't much wrong with World's approach, and in many ways, there's probably a really good middle ground between what the game and Wilds are doing that they need to shoot for. Most of all, they need to be smarter about what hardware they're aiming for. The recommended specs for Wilds on Steam lists the RTX 2060 Super as its GPU. The spec sheet for this game is infamous for its recommended specifications listing frame generation as a requirement to hit 60 frames per second at 1080p with medium settings. In other words, Capcom designed the game to run at 1080p 30 frames on PC with similar hardware to a PS5. What's worse is that the most used cards on Steam are all budget cards that aren't much stronger than the 2060 Super, not strong enough to hit 60 frames native on the same settings. This is where much of the performance complaints come from because, as we've said, 60 frames is seen as the standard. If Capcom wants to list the 2060 Super as their recommended card, then they need it to hit 60 frames natively. But how do they achieve this? Truth be told, I think they need to actively change how Wilds functions right now, whether that involves reducing small monster hordes, aggressive culling of things you can't see, or a reduction on the ecological simulations. As it stands, Wilds doesn't have much of a future if they can't get performance working right. The December update allegedly altered 100 or so different processes, and they still couldn't get the recommended specifications to run at a native 60 frames, so it's clear they have to do much more than that, and perhaps begin by reducing existing game functions. Arguably they already have. Part of the reason monsters were so active was due to a mechanic where they could stumble across your subcamps and destroy them. The game had to track them discovering the subcamp, approaching and destroying them, even when you were doing something else on the other side of the map. This feature was removed because people found it too annoying, which means a key feature of Wilds has already been changed. More of this probably needs to happen. And sadly, that means Yuya Tokuda's vision will have to be curbed and compromised. The living, breathing world he wanted for Monster Hunter will simply not be possible the way he envisioned, unless the hardware market fixes itself, or if he gets smarter about his approach, which makes me wonder where the developers go from here. In the future, video games across the board will have to be much more conservative in their ambitions in order to maintain consistent performance while also aiming for lower PC specifications. For Monster Hunter, that means they'll have to completely change their approach to having a real thriving ecosystem in their games. Whether that means giving up on it entirely or totally rethinking their approach, change is guaranteed. I've been a big advocate for Monster Hunter Wilds being ported to the Switch too. Not only have I been saying it's going to happen for some time, I think it could also force the developers to figure out ways of optimizing the game for all platforms. Specs wise, the Switch 2 is more or less equivalent to the minimum PC requirements, but it also has to run off a battery. A Switch 2 Wilds port would also have to be one-to-one with every other platform in terms of both content and features. And in addition to all this, Capcom would need it to do very well, judging by how Wilds' sales have totally flatlined post-March 2025. In my opinion, they can't afford this port being a disaster too. Let's be honest, the game cannot survive another major PR crisis like that. So hopefully, a good Switch 2 port could allow for a big performance boost for all platforms, and maybe even a second wind for the game as a whole. Honestly, assuming the game industry survives the next 5 years, I would guess that the Switch 2 will become the new baseline for video games. It's something I've talked about on social media, but it hasn't become relevant in a video until now. If a game can run on the Switch 2 at 30 frames per second, then realistically it can run on most gaming PCs and the PS5 to greater degrees, more than likely hitting 60 frames at higher resolutions. We can already see games like Resident Evil 9 or Pragmata running great on PCs, and they're coming to Switch 2 on launch day. Square Enix have also confirmed they're targeting the Switch 2 and Steam Deck for Part 3 of the FF7 Remake trilogy, something that was initially supposed to target the PS5. As for Monster Hunter, our first big preview of what this dynamic will look like is Stories 3 Twisted Reflection coming in March. It's an open world game that is targeting the Switch 2 but releasing on all platforms on the same day. I don't know how the Switch 2 version of that game runs, but it's fairly clear that every other version will run better. I expect the same for Ichinose's game, the successor to Rise. But neither of those games are directed by Yuya Tokuda, who has said that he wants to pursue the creation of these ecosystems in every game he creates. We can only assume that will come with Monster Hunter 7, the successor to Wilds, releasing beyond 2030. I've speculated on this in a prior video and on social media, but I'll say it plainly now. That game is targeting the Switch 2 as well. No Japanese game will ever skip that system going forward, as it's hugely popular there and will allow for lower hardware requirements as well as boosted performance on other platforms. Unlike a future Wilds port, it would be designed for the system from the ground up, which means whatever their approach to Ecology, it will be quite different too. And yes, it will technically be a generation behind in hardware compared to Wilds, but this is not the first time something like this has happened. I think of how Monster Hunter games, despite being designed for consoles, thrived on handhelds and received ports with stripped down features but more content. The last time I can recall a generational step backwards was when Monster Hunter Tri was designed for the Nintendo Wii, but then 3 Ultimate and later 4 Ultimate were instead designed for the 3DS, and you could feel the differences between the 3rd gen games in particular. There were several aspects of Tri that were far more robust, such as the online or small monster counts. Jaggy hordes are not this big in 3 Ultimates. so Monster Hunter 7 would certainly have downgrades compared to Wilds. However, if it's guaranteed better performance on every system, people have overwhelmingly shown that they would take that trade. But what would this mean for Tokuda's vision? The fact of the matter is, this was his dream for the games. A living, breathing ecosystem, abundant with different forms of life, all doing their different things, together or apart. His goal with Wilds was to go further than World in this matter, but it will be borderline impossible to go beyond Wilds for the foreseeable future. This goal, this dream, this vision might be over for a while, or at least will have to be rethought. I can't help but wonder how he and the development team must feel about all this. World felt like the game they had always wanted to make, and ended up being an enormous success. It's clear they designed every aspect of Wilds with that success in mind, only to face such, and perhaps warranted, backlash, as well as this daunting future. I think, judging by other aspects of Wilds, it is clear they misread why Monster Hunter World did so well. The fans' love for these ecosystems was perhaps not so all-encompassing that they would take it over a stable framerate. However, I can't say for certain if they were wrong to pursue it, because objectively, people were fine with World's poor console performance, not to mention there were a sizable amount of people that missed the ecosystems and details when they played Rise. People do like this stuff, but in the current day, they like stability more, and I think Capcom is now very aware of that. What Tokuda's approach will be going forward from this will be interesting to witness. I don't think they have to totally abandon the concept of having these robust ecosystems, but the abundant criticism and changing hardware landscape indicates that what they've done with Wilds will not be replicated. Earlier I said that Wilds did not lead with its best foot forward in terms of presenting its ecosystem to us, and that it was pretty much glorified background detail. That is to say, it often never factors into the actual main Monster Hunter gameplay loop to a significant degree, which is why so many people would be fine with the game sacrificing it all for solid performance, which is more important for an action game. It's a really weird move on behalf of the developers, because all the life in the Forbidden Lands is something they've obviously spent a lot of time working on and implementing. What I think it could boil down to is that Tokuda's vision for the original Monster Hunter didn't really come from the game itself. It came from watching the original trailer, and the ideas he had for the world were based on it. Naturally, he played the game and joined Capcom soon after and worked on every other game, but he was attracted to the games for the world the trailer presented, and wanted to heavily enhance this aspect. The fact that all this ecosystem stuff ends up as background detail and doesn't end up mattering that much in Monster Hunter's main gameplay loop does track with that. If Tokuda is this insistent on having these living, breathing ecosystems, then, in addition to being more conservative with power aside, I think he should figure out ways to bring it into the actual gameplay loop. For example, perhaps giving us the job of actively researching these critters. Imagine if there were side quests dedicated to figuring out where the wind rustlers go during the sand tide, or what Kranodath feed on, or what other life benefits from monster corpses. It would motivate people to actively seek out and discover and appreciate so many details in this setting. The fact there's nothing of the sort is baffling, especially because so much time and effort went into it. I refer to how people turned against the ecosystem aspect because it began to interfere with the actual monster hunting by tanking performance. I also mentioned how, during the time of Rise, a ton of World fans were lamenting that the game even existed or was getting support, and wanted it to end so we could all move on to a true World sequel. This used to annoy me because I liked Rise a lot, and was glad to see the game getting updates. What's really fascinating is that after Wilds, it's all reversed. We now have people going, ugh, I just wish they'd wrap up Wilds so we could move on to the Rise successor, or, at the prospect of Wilds coming to Switch 2, I'd much rather have a performance patch for Rise. If you told me from 2021 that this would happen to the World sequel, it would have blown my mind. But it does make me wonder. We discussed Yuya Tokuda's vision for Monster Hunter at length, but what is Yasunori Ichinose's? Ichinose, from my understanding, has never really spoken on this topic, so people tend to interpret his vision based on what is in his games. The portable series of Monster Hunter is always fairly low budget, and often derivative of the main games in terms of the bulk of the content. But Ichinose's unique touch as of late has been combat related. Generations had hunter styles and arts, Rise had silk binds and switch skills, and they allowed for crazy new combat possibilities. Lots of different options that really let you adjust your moveset and move around. This results in people interpreting the main and portable series of Monster Hunter as a rivalry between Ecology and Combat, World vs Rise, Tokuda vs Ichinose. The fact Rise didn't have much in the name of Ecology was seen as a notable downside back in the day. However, post-Wilds, it's now seen as a major advantage because by comparison, it runs like a total dream, with it being very easy to maintain max settings and frame rates, even on mid-range PCs. Now, totally divorced from the expectations of being a Monster Hunter game to succeed world, seeing as Wilds has taken that spot, Rise's strengths have finally been allowed to shine, being a Monster Hunter that focuses purely on movement and combat, letting nothing get in the way of that. I would guess that just like how the strong desire to move on from Rise back then came from a dissatisfaction with the game, and the desire for a Monster Hunter with a focus on ecology again, this time, the desire to move on from Wilds comes from a dissatisfaction with this game, and a desire for a new Monster Hunter with a focus on combat again, free from the quote-unquote pointless fluff of Wilds. But I don't know about that entirely. Like I said, the portable games are very derivative. Rise's seamless locales and visuals came entirely from the pressure of world success. I would assume that the next Ichinose game will probably adopt a fair amount of features from Wilds too. My guess is the changing seasons and field survey system in particular. On the other hand, the vocal backlash to Wilds may also make them stray away from that game, which would be a unique inverse of Rise. I personally hope not, because Wilds has a lot of good in it that I'd like to see carried forward. One last thing before we wrap up. People blame the RE engine for why Wilds runs badly. Reach for the Moon is the engine all Capcom games run on, including their last several Resident Evils, Street Fighter 6, Rise, Wilds, and even the upcoming Twisted Reflection. The prevailing opinion is that Reach for the Moon was built for games with small areas like Resident Evil and not open world games. And the solid performance of, say, the Resident Evil games compared to that of Dragon's Dogma 2 is used as an example. They have small spaces, while Dragon's Dogma 2 is open world, which would be the cause of the issues, and as such, people say the same is true for Wilds. I've spoken against this in my Wilds review and will do so once more. It's not the fault of the engine, and contrary to popular belief, the RE engine was probably the best choice for Wilds. Had they gone with, say, Unreal Engine 5, the game would have taken several years longer to release due to a need for the developers to familiarise themselves with a whole new engine, and probably would have run worse. Had they stuck with World's empty framework, which was designed for the PS3, it would have been a disaster too. The fact of the matter is, Wilds runs the way it does because Yuya Tokuda wanted to push the PS5 to the absolute limit to achieve his vision of a living, breathing world. This outcome was guaranteed regardless of the engine. And one more thing, Wilds is not an open world game. It's closer to Mario Odyssey in structure than it is to Breath of the Wild. It's a sandbox game. Rise didn't have closed off areas, its environments were quite open as well, yet that game ran fine even on the Nintendo Switch. People might counter that by saying, oh, well that's because Rise is doing nothing with its environment, while Wilds has a lot going on. And doesn't that more or less prove the point of the video? Wilds' ecological simulations are why the game runs badly. It's nothing to do with the engine at the end of the day. The next several years of Monster Hunter are looking to be very interesting from a hardware perspective. The future of this robust ecology we've seen in Monster Hunter Wilds, this living, breathing world, is looking much more uncertain. Whenever I conclude a video, I always say I'd love to hear people's thoughts on the topics discussed, and I always mean it. I like talking to people about Monster Hunter, and the things you guys say on occasion have influenced how I feel on something I've spoken about, or sometimes changed it completely. This video, for example, would not exist without comments on that Wilds review. And so in this case, I'm really eager to hear what everyone thinks about the ecosystem, World's approach, Rises, Wilds, what you'd be willing to sacrifice, what you feel about the future, details you like in Wilds that you feel are necessary to the experience. It's a very deep topic with a lot of implications for the future, and I'd love to hear from everyone. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to check out my other videos. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.